When it comes to Western role-playing games, few video game developers are as renowned as BioWare. The Edmonton-based studio's catalog is as celebrated as it is influential, with almost all of its titles representing the peaks of their genres in the eras they debuted. Baldur's Gate brought computer RPGs back in vogue with its sublime high fantasy gameplay. Neverwinter Nights masterfully adapted its tenets into a multiplayer-centric experience. Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic saw the former game's narrative finesse melded with the adventurism of the galaxy far, far away. And Mass Effect made all of this BioWare's own, while taking it to the next level. But being this renowned comes with a high price. For creating cutting-edge experiences in the games industry is almost always a struggle. And BioWare has especially struggled, with nearly every major production that the studio has successfully completed representing a triumph in the face of massive adversity. Dragon Age, BioWare's much-beloved high fantasy series, is perhaps most emblematic of this. While each of its mainline entries were made under vastly different circumstances from one another, they all suffered in their own unique ways. Its third one's design failed to fully come together until late in its production, and needed to be made in an incredibly unruly engine. Its second one's development period was one of the most cramped its staff had ever experienced. And its first operated without a consistent team or set of tools for an immensely long time. So much so that many wondered if it was ever going to come out at all. This is the history of Dragon Age Origins. When Origins released to the world in November of 2009, it came after months of BioWare touting it in interviews and previews as a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate. Its setting, combat system, and narrative were all repeatedly framed as modern takes on what the fabled role-playing franchise had offered a decade prior, crafted to enrapture both series veterans and neophytes alike. However, this hadn't always been exactly what BioWare had wanted the project to be. In a 2018 retrospective published by Eurogamer, Mike Laidlaw, the Dragon Age series' former chief designer, would recall how it wasn't until director Dan Tudge told Origins' development team to aim for this vision that it fully became part of its identity. Before this, the game's identity had meandered for a while, with BioWare only letting a modicum of the studio's staff attempt to hash it out for the first few years of its production, which began in late 2002. At the time, the studio was eager to start creating and controlling its own video game properties, having worked almost exclusively with other companies' licenses since its founding in 1995. Both Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights were tied to the world of Dungeons & Dragons, and Knights of the Old Republic, which was due to release the following year, was part of the Star Wars universe. Nearly everyone agreed that the studio had succeeded in imbuing all of these experiences with its creative thumbprint, but the studio believed it could do so much more with fantasy worlds of its own design. Thus, work began at BioWare on an original high fantasy-themed role-playing game titled Chronicle. For the first few years of its existence, development was sluggish. As revealed by Brent Knowles, another one of the game's main designers, in a 2015 interview with RPG Codex, it took a long time for the manpower and technology fueling Chronicle's creation to stabilize. Many of its staff were constantly being pulled away to help on concurrent projects, like the Usha-inspired Jade Empire, and the tools that were being used to make it were in a continuous state of flux. And yet, slowly but surely, its design would come into focus. David Gator, one of the project's earliest and most prominent writers, would spend a long time hashing out the basics of its world and lore, conceiving a dark, realistic setting inspired just as much by the works of George R.R. Martin as it was by the works of Tolkien. Where other high fantasy worlds featured more fanciful and lighthearted societies, Chronicles would be considerably grounded, with its races beset by issues intrinsic to our own reality, such as racism and classism. Players would be given the opportunity to embody one of several characters, each of which would possess a completely different origin story, and this would affect the way everyone else in the game's world would regard them. Meanwhile, its gameplay would take place from both a top-down perspective, in addition to a third-person perspective reminiscent of old republics. And when the game debuted to the public for the first time at the 2004 Electronic Entertainment Expo under the name Dragon Age, it would also be announced that it was going to feature a multiplayer campaign, complete with its own streamlined story. After 2004, BioWare would go dark on Dragon Age for a long period of time. Because of how slowly its development had been progressing up until this point, the studio decided that the project wouldn't make any more public appearances until both its features and the technology that would support them were fully bolted down. In retrospect, this would prove to be a wise move, as the next few years would see Dragon Age undergo a number of changes, some spurred by the arrival of key individuals on its development team, like Dan Tudge and Mike Laidlaw, and others by said team figuring out what they could and couldn't do with their current resources. In addition to the game's mechanics and rules being rebalanced over and over, the number of potential origin stories that would be available to the player were scaled down a fair bit, as a result of its developers realizing how much work they were to implement. And, perhaps most significantly, its multiplayer component was gutted entirely, never to be heard from again. During an extended appearance on Canadian radio station 102.1 The Edge in 2015, Gator would describe the project as an exercise in scope creep. Its team had a seemingly endless amount of ideas on how to further plus it, but inevitably, they had to pull back on their ambitions and focus on creating a finished product. Eventually, Dragon Age would be re-unveiled in 2008 as Dragon Age Origins, sporting a much more defined identity and story than what was present in its previous appearance. The player would now be fighting for the future of Thedas, a magic-strewn land inhabited by humans, elves, dwarves, and the metallic-skinned Qunari. Regardless of which origin they chose, the player would quickly be inducted into the Grey Wardens, a legendary order of knights that has been relied upon since time immemorial to protect Thedas from the monstrous Darkspawn, which are on the verge of launching a cataclysmic upheaval known as the Blight. It would also be unveiled later in the year that Origins would be seeing a release on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, thanks to the porting efforts of Austin-based developer Edge of Reality. All of this came at something of a peculiar time for BioWare. The Canadian studio was riding high on the success of Mass Effect the year prior, yet it had also just been acquired by EA, prompting concerns from longtime fans that the mega-publisher would attempt to meddle in its affairs going forward, and force the studio's games to conform to its own vision of what it considered popular. However, while EA influence would eventually be felt later on in the series, it wouldn't attempt to intervene in any significant way on Origins. According to Brent Knowles, the project had been pushed back so many times at this point that nobody in their right mind wanted to risk delaying it any further.
It is finished. Welcome.
As Origins' release date neared, anticipation only grew stronger among the BioWare faithful. The game looked like it was shaping up to be a tremendous experience, one that held the souls of its developers' old-school classics close to its heart, yet still felt thoroughly distinct from them. Well, the proof would ultimately be in the pudding. It seemed to many like it was poised to be another BioWare hit, and enrapture a much wider audience than its genre typically enjoyed, just as Mass Effect had done. But BioWare itself had its reservations. Publicly, it expressed nothing but confidence in Origins' ability to succeed, pointing to the success of games like The Witcher and Obsidian Entertainment's Neverwinter Nights 2 as proof that there still existed plenty of interest in high fantasy fiction. Both the enduring popularity of this genre and Origins' many modern innovations, it asserted, would enable it to attract such an audience. Yet behind the scenes, it wondered whether this would be enough. Traditional PC-centric role-playing games had been waning in popularity over the past few years, with its few surviving stalwarts, like Fallout and The Elder Scrolls, having adopted more simplified, action-oriented designs with their most recent iterations, and there was no way of knowing how thoroughly Dragon Age's darker interpretation of its subject matter would resonate with audiences. For these reasons, BioWare would decide late in development to implement a detailed epilogue at the end of Origins, in order to show what happened in the long term to the player's companions and the lands they saved. If it never got a chance to make a sequel, it could at least provide ample closure on everything players had experienced. When Origins would finally arrive at storefronts, however, these concerns would all turn out to be for naught, with the game quickly finding an audience as massive as it was passionate. Critics loved how unabashedly deep its combat system was, as well as how much flexibility it allowed for, the breadth of choice it offered in terms of letting one finesse their abilities, as well as micromanage themselves and their allies' actions in the middle of battle, felt so empowering. And when they weren't fighting alongside the player, these very allies proved incredibly satisfying to interact with, providing humor, romance, and emotional catharsis in equal measure for all that entertain relationships with them.
I'll accept that. It's something to hope for, at least.
Oh, lovely. Shall we next begin rescuing kittens from trees?
Outside of BioWare's own catalog, there existed few other games pundits could point to at the time that featured characters as multidimensional and intriguing as those that Thedas had to offer, or for that matter, a world as richly realized as Thedas itself. However, not everything about Origins tickled players' fancy. The game's story drew flack for falling hard on its share of clichés, such as having the main thrust of its plot follow a predictable hero's journey. Its visuals underwhelmed, as did its occasionally wooden character animations. And its share of difficulty spikes convinced more players than BioWare would have liked to abandon their campaigns early on. The PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions of the game would also be singled out for not feeling as well optimized as they could have been. While both ports had duly reworked their combat systems to be less tactical and more action-oriented, a concession made to accommodate for the home console's lack of mouse and keyboard support. Parts of their user interfaces still felt like they had been poorly configured to fit their hardware. Yet in the end, these issues would do little to stop players from thoroughly enjoying all of the game's iterations. After working on Origins for 7 odd years, one might have thought that BioWare would have been ready to drop it as soon as it launched and move on to the next big thing. Instead, the studio would continue to rigorously support it post-release. Not only would it supply the game with a steady stream of downloadable content for nearly a year, but it would also greatly incentivize fans to mod it for even longer, releasing a developer-grade toolset with Origins PC version for the Enterprise to take advantage of. During the latter years of the game's development, BioWare co-founders Ray Muzyka and Greg Zeschuk had repeatedly stressed that the game would function as both a singular, self-contained experience, as well as a platform that would be continuously added to over time. And once it finally got out in the wild, it would more than deliver on this promise. Of all these additions, the biggest and most important it received would be Dragon Age Origins Awakening, a full-fledged expansion to the base game. Released by BioWare in March of 2010, Awakening saw players embark on a quest to defeat a new and highly intelligent breed of Darkspawn some 6 months after resolving Origins' primary conflict. A few minor additions to the base game's meta aside, including a raised level cap, and some slight improvements to its mechanics, the expansion didn't represent a particularly large departure from what Origins had offered gameplay-wise, focusing more on providing new areas, quests, and lore to relish over than reinventing the wheel. Critics almost unanimously agreed that it was a more than worthwhile experience. It wasn't perfect and had little to offer to players who couldn't get into the series first go, but to Dragon Age veterans, it was a must-play, especially if one wanted a glimpse into what BioWare was preparing for their next outing. In one fell swoop, BioWare had succeeded in carving out a new empire for itself within the realm of high fantasy games. Origin's unique mix of both old-school and new-school design values had galvanized role-playing fans across generations into picking it up, and Awakening had cemented its brand as being one that would endure for generations to come. If the studio had one regret about the way it had reached this point, It was the way it had designed Origins' epilogue. As Gator would later explain, both he and the rest of the series' writers would end up wishing that the epilogue had not forecast so far ahead as to what became of Thetis after the base game's events, because it made it difficult for them to plan out where the series' story would go next without accidentally contradicting something that it had already established. In order to make things less hard on themselves, the team would eventually decide to render the epilogue non-canon, recasting everything that happens in it as hearsay and rumors. But as they would soon discover, this would do little to make the series' future any easier to create. For everything they had taken for granted during Origins' development, including the amount of time that they were given to conceptualize it, was about to change.